Hi, good afternoon. My name is Vimalendra Sharan. I'm director of the FAO North America office based out of Washington, D.C. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event, which we are co-hosting with Eco Agriculture Partners. It's a very old partnership that we have with them, and this is in a series of speaker series events. So we have already had a couple last year, and we will be having many more in years to come and months to come. With eco agriculture, as you all know, we have these conversation around landscape and in its various facets, and discuss this over a roundtable in our offices and also in a bigger gathering like this, where normally we get a much larger crowd, but I'm told this one is live streamed, and that's the price you pay for having good technology in place. Most of you may be aware of what FAO is. Some of you, I'm sure, will not be, as has been my experience with the DC crowd, that many people are not really aware of what FAO does or is. So, very briefly, we are the oldest of the UN organizations, founded in 1945, and we have been mandated, or we are mandated, with leading and supporting the global effort to ensure a hunger-free and a malnutrition-free world. And in terms of SDG 2, we are supposed to be delivering upon that goal by 2030. Now, it's obvious that to deliver upon SDG 2, we need to understand the dynamic relationship between climate change and its impact on agriculture and other aspects linked to agriculture. And any effective action to deal with this must include involvement, appropriate action, and results at subnational level, and in particular at local or community level. We are all very well aware that most of the time, many farmers and small landholders face problems in sustainable production, and these problems originate off farm. They're not necessarily linked to the farm, and therefore involves many sectors outside just agriculture. And to really answer these challenges and to handle these challenges, we need an approach which is not siloed, and that is where the landscape approach really comes in place. I won't say it is a panacea, it's not a cure-all, but it is definitely one of the vehicles which can take us forward, because in essence it is comprehensively addressing production systems, natural resources, and other land use in a physical area that is large enough to produce vital ecosystem services and yet small enough to be managed by people who depend on those services. So what do we do about all this in FAO? And that's a very valid question, because being mandated to lead and support global agriculture, how are we looking at it? So let me just tell you that in FAO, we have actually mainstreamed this approach. Or let me be more honest. We have not totally mainstreamed this approach, but we are in the process of mainstreaming this approach in our work. That's an honest answer. So it's becoming the way in which FAO is now looking at things, breaking down silos, even moving across sectors to ensure that the smallholder farmer is really benefited by this approach, for the simple reason that if we look at crop production, livestock, forestry, fishery, all this falls under our mandate. And therefore, it is extremely important for us to appreciate the advantages of using the landscape approach when we go into our developmental exercise. What have we been doing all these years? So on this, we have some important programs in forest and landscape restoration and integrated landscape management, where we are developing guidelines, training courses, and related tools to help countries restore productive land that can sustainably produce more food, forest fiber, etc. Recently, FAO has been selected to lead the Dryland Sustainable Landscape Global Impact Program of GEF. This is a $106 million GEF program in 11 countries of Africa and Asia, and this is in partnership with the World Bank. We will be leading the program in Angola, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Tanzania, and also co-leading in Kazakhstan and Mongolia. So it's a huge program going forward. And this initiative will address the complex interaction between maintaining resilient production systems in drylands, promoting restoration, and improving livelihoods through a comprehensive landscape approach. We have been traditionally also promoting and building capacity within countries in several areas that are related to climate mitigation and adaptation. And these are in addition to what I just mentioned about forest and landscape restoration, or the ILM, the integrated landscape management. We are working with countries on climate smart agriculture, agroecology, sustainable food and agriculture, sustainable forest management, conservation agriculture, and many others. And FAO has developed a huge number of practical tools and information resources which are available in the public domain. These are global public goods which can be accessed by everyone. We have the Agroecology Knowledge Hub. We have our latest publication on sustainable food and agriculture and an integrated approach, Climate Smart Agriculture Sourcebook, and many other publications which are out there to be accessed. Much is happening, I'll say, but much more needs to be done. I think that is something which we all must acknowledge, that on the way forward is full of challenges, and these challenges are both at policy level and at implementation level. These challenges are both in terms of human resources, capacities, and in terms of financial resources. And there's no easy answer at all. And all stakeholders who are working in this field, I think all of us need to come together to really put our resources and our strengths in sync if we desire this approach to be the approach going forward. The discussion today and our eminent panelists, I'm sure, will put forth their views and their work. And I'm quite keen to listen to them. We have the policymaker, and we have somebody from the farm, and we have policy advisors. So you have a very good mix of the panel here, which will talk to you in some time. That said, it is my proud privilege to welcome Sarah here to come and share her thoughts with us. Those of you in this room, I'm sure all of you must be knowing her, because if you're in this room, I assume that you are here because you're interested in the landscapes approach. And if you are interested in the landscape approach, you cannot be in this city and not know her. So no introduction, no formal introduction for her, but just in case one or two of you, if you do not know her, then she is an agriculture and natural resource economist. I've taken this from your website, I hope it's right. She's an agriculture and natural resource economist specializing in land management policy in tropical developing countries. She has been a prominent voice globally in promoting the restoration of degraded agricultural land for food security and rural livelihoods, and is a leading innovator in integrated landscape management. She is, of course, the guru of landscape approach. So, Sarah, the floor is yours.
And I'll invite you all to come in and take a seat. You took my bio list. Yeah. No. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Wim-Linda, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure. It has been for many years now to be working with FAO on this topic. I'm the president and CEO of Eco Agriculture Partners, which is an NGO that's been working since 2002 to try to promote sustainable landscapes that provide food, feed, fiber, fish, ecosystem services for the well-being, cultural services from the land and water resources in their landscape. For the people who live there, others who depend upon it, and also for the wild biodiversity that requires those lands for their habitat. Climate change has been one of the central focuses of Eco Agriculture Partners since the very beginning, looking at how climate change affects different dimensions of landscapes, and also how clever and coordinated landscape management across different sectors can actually contribute to the mitigation of climate change and also accelerate the adaptation to climate change. We do curriculum and training and advisory work and analytical work and policy dialogue work, of which this is one of the examples. I want to also Welcome the folks who are joining us from YouTube, from all around the world. It may be early or late for you all, but we invite you to be part of this conversation. There's a chat function that you can send in question marks and our questions that you may have, and our staff will relay those to the larger group as we move forward. The critical role of land use in climate action is finally getting the attention that it has merited all along. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report finds that agriculture and land use are responsible for 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and that's from deforestation and from agricultural emissions, from livestock, from methane, from rice, soil and nutrient management and degradation. Far more is then added to that from forest degradation, forest fires, and agricultural burning. A very interesting report that came out in 2017 called Drawdown, from which the title of this session was drawn by Paul Hawkins and colleagues, showed that farming, forest, and land use interventions were 12 of the top 20 interventions that were considered the most practical, the most cost-effective, highest impact, and rapid solutions for addressing climate change. On the adaptation side, the newest reports are suggesting that we could have very substantial reductions in yields from climate change if we don't take other action. Furthermore, farming and farming communities in rural areas are going to be hit and have been hit by droughts and various natural disasters, flooding, et cetera, that we need landscapes to be designed and managed in order to mitigate these risks as well. So these values of land use in climate action are also being recognized now in the policy domain. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change now has a program called the Coronivia Work Program. Some folks here have been involved in trying to advance that, focused on the role of agriculture. The countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement on climate and the nationally determined action plans that they are putting together have it is remarkably dominant actions in agriculture and land use, far more than I think many people had expected. And there's many programs now, 30 by 30, Global Food and Land Challenge. Here in the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has its climate hubs. There's the North American Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance, which is starting to gain steam here. But climate's not our only concern. Just while we need to be concerned about climate change, we also had this recent report about the enormous threats for biodiversity. We need to be paying attention to that. We've had another major report about the need to transform healthy and sustainable food systems in a pretty dramatic way. Indeed, all of the Sustainable Development Goals, what Wim Wenders was saying, the SDGs, require that we think about solving these problems together in an integrated way. It also means that however ambitious our actions may be at the national and international level, where the rubber hits the road is at the local level. It's at the landscape or territorial level. And what we're going to talk about today in this seminar are some of the advances that are being made in taking that action to the ground from a number of different perspectives. We will explore these with our speakers. The first of our speakers will be Fred Yoder. You want to wave there, Fred? Fred is a fourth-generation farmer who's lived and farmed in Iowa for more than 40 years. Oops, Ohio. My apologies to Ohioans. He's also served as president of the National Corn Growers Association. He's very embedded in the farming community in this country. He's also been a leader in the Solutions from the Land initiative and subsequent nonprofit organization, with the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, and with the North American Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance. So he's going to give us a perspective from the ground, from the farmer's perspective, and from the experience that Ohio has had in developing its own Ohio Smart Agriculture. The second person to speak will also be representing the United States. That's Ben Grumbles, who is the state of Maryland's Secretary of the Environment. He's also the chair of the Governor's Chesapeake Bay Cabinet and chair of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative within the Northeast region. He was previously president of the U.S. Water Alliance, so he has a really good perspective on what's going on across the United States. Our third speaker will be Shaila Raga, who is the climate change lead at Conservation International. She'll be talking a little bit about their Sustainable Landscapes program. She's also previously worked at the World Bank in the Adaptation Fund and United Nations Development Program, and with the UNFCCC. So she comes from a good perspective about linking landscapes with some of those global initiatives. And she was also recently named in Styles Magazine's Badass Woman, which we're all most impressed from in terms of her. Whatever. And finally, we'll have another perspective from Ivy Moraes, who's the Sustainable Development Policy Officer of the Network of Regional Governments for Sustainable Development, which has a major program on climate change, as well as integrating their work across the Sustainable Development Goals. She's previously held positions in Brazil at the São Paulo City Hall, UN Habitat, and the Inter-American Development Bank, among others. So we're going to get a wide range of perspectives, and with that, I would like to invite the speakers to each make a brief presentation about what they've been up to and what their organizations and some of the experiences that they have had in this territorial, landscape, or jurisdictional level local approaches to taking action on climate change that affects climate but also embraces the range of other development objectives that people have in their landscapes. So I'd like to start with Fred.
Well, thank you very much. I guess I'm on. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to speak here. I really appreciate it because these subjects are very dear and near to my heart. Just a little bit about myself, in addition to what she read, was I'm a farmer. I've been farming for over 40 years in central Ohio. I raise corn, soybeans, and wheat. We also have a seed retail business, as well as we sell precision agriculture products to farmers, and we do a lot of consulting too through Yoderec Services. And one of the things that happened to me about 15 years ago was I wasn't making any money farming, and so I had to figure out ways to cut costs. And one of the ways I thought might be the best way was maybe to go to no-till. Some of the newer technologies were coming out to try to do that. So I originally started conservation tillage with the aspect of saving money. But after a couple of years of that, and that was even before we integrated cover crops, I saw a tremendous improvement in my soils. And so I today would never go back to the way I used to farm because my soil is much richer. I have earthworms, so I have much better cover on the top, and I'm able to take some of that dry weather as well as and increase my ability to absorb water. And I've told the story earlier. We had a drought in 1988 that was they said it was one of the most severe droughts in the Midwest, and I remember the yields were basically non-existent. And then we had another big drought in 2012, which actually was even a worse drought. And yet we had better than a half a crop in 2012 versus 1988. And why was that? Even if it had less water, it's because of technology and because of some of the practices that I use today. And also the genetics were much better. So you think farmers don't pay attention to the weather pattern changes or the climate? They live and die by that. So farmers are reluctant to talk about climate change because we politicize it, but they're very much willing to talk about weather pattern changes. So just, talk about it the way they want to talk about it. So one of the things that I've always been passionate about is doing things better and doing things in a way that improves things that we didn't have before. And that's why my good friend A.G. Caramaro and Ernie, they invited us to the Global Alliance of Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance meetings a few years ago. And one of the things that was just really shocking to me is there weren't more farmers that were actually participating. AG was there as the Secretary of Agriculture from California, or past there. But so one of the things that AG did was really push to get more farmers there. If people are going to talk about how to improve things, then you better have farmers at the table, because those farmers are the ones that are going to have to implement any kind of program there is. So got involved in we call it GAXA, but then Also wanted to divide up and have more regional chapters, and that's where we formed the North American Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance, or NACSA, and that's I'm the chair of that. But we all do this from our nonprofit called Solutions from the Land. And that's really what the basis I really want to talk about today is. Agriculture is looked at very negatively in some circles as the culprit of everything bad. But yet, if you do it right, it's really, really going to be difficult to, I lost my train of thought. He had 2 minutes up there.
It's all right.
Okay.
But we can actually be the solution to many things. One of the best things we can do is use the climate smart agriculture 3-pillar example. Now, pillar number 1 is sustainable intensification or profitability. Pillar number 2 is going to be adaptation and soil resiliency, which farmers want to do. And pillar 3 would be the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Farmers can relate to CSA or climate smart agriculture. I would say that whatever we do, we need to include that. Farmers also need to realize that they can offer ecosystem services, and that's something that we really have to understand, that there's benefits to every man, woman, and child on this earth if we do some things in a different way. So maybe we can talk about it more, but there's just an awful lot of things that we can do. But the first thing we have to do is focus on the economic examples of how a farmer can move forward. That's how you're going to get them to change things. Thank you.
I'd like to just ask you a follow-up question, Fred. I know that in addition to the work that you've done on your own farm and the work that you've done with the Alliance and with Solutions from the Land, you've also been part of this Ohio Smart Agriculture. Can you just take 1 minute and tell us what you all have been doing in the state of Ohio that links climate change with the other objectives that you have in the state?
Certainly, and I wanted to mention the whole thing about landscape. One of the things that we're hit with in Ohio, as in a regional area, is we got some water quality issues with the algal blooms in Lake Erie. And there's nothing to get your attention than to be forced into coming up with a solution. So one of the things that you have to realize is landscapes are different. Watersheds are different. You can't treat a one-size-fits-all. So we have our own special issues in Ohio. As a matter of fact, we're so wet now, we haven't even planted anything. So I'm here because we're not planting corn.
Can't farm.
Can't farm, so I'm here. My point is, what we're doing, we come up with this Ohio Smart Agriculture Solution from the Land project, where it started out to be more of a food security, more of a systems approach. But with that comes the environmental outcomes of how you do that. And there's lots of things that we talk about, and many people didn't even realize what farming was all about today because we're 2 or 3 generations away from being connected to the farm. It's a great way to reconnect. I learned a lot about food security and the infrastructure to get food to the needy, and they learned it off from me to how to connect and do things in a much better way. We're not farming anything like we did 30 years ago. That's the thing that people don't understand is we have not, and we probably done a poor job of showing how much more efficient we are today than we were before.
Thank you very much. Let's move from the sort of farm-focused and local-focused to Ben. Tell us a little bit more about what's been going on in the state of Maryland and the other states that you've been working with on climate action.
Thanks, Sarah. It is great to be here, and I appreciate everybody listening in or participating in the audience today. I'm the Secretary for the Environment for the state of Maryland. Governor Larry Hogan is the Republican governor who's putting a real priority on bipartisan environmental progress, certainly on climate change and on Chesapeake Bay. And so as the Environment Secretary for the state, our focus is not just on what happens within Maryland and on the land, but also what happens within the 64,000 square mile watershed for the Chesapeake Bay from New York to the tip of Virginia, the largest estuary in the country, certainly one of the largest in the world, a very shallow bay, and it just underscores the intense need to manage the land for water quality, but also for climate progress. For water quality, we know the history of the land is written in the water, and so what our state is doing with the other 6 states that are coordinated with the nonprofit and the local governments and the federal agencies is to meet a pollution reduction budget for the Chesapeake Bay that reduces nutrients and sediments and develops specific plans that are locally driven, achievable, and balanced. And we are focusing very much on soil health and phosphorus management. The agriculture industry is Maryland's largest industry and one of its most important for environmental stewardship. So a really important area of focus for the state of Maryland is working with, not against, agriculture and finding ways to continue to protect local and regional water quality and use markets such as nutrient credit trading to bring more partners to the table. It's a very important strategy. It's also a strategy that has been used and must be used for climate progress. We know we have to focus on more than just smokestacks and tailpipes. We need to focus on the transition to cleaner energy and also smart agriculture, managing the land in ways that are productive for agriculture as a sector and really emphasize resiliency and adaptation. Saltwater intrusion is one of our priority areas of focus, as well as erosion and loss of productive farmland. So we work together very closely through our Bipartisan Climate Change Commission, through our commitments in the state of Maryland for making real and lasting progress on climate change. One of the areas, we have one very specific example, and that's our Healthy Soils Initiative. Maryland, our Department of Agriculture, our Department of Natural Resources are teaming up with nonprofit organizations and local citizens and businesses and the agricultural community to advance soil health, as well as continue to make progress on our state's no net loss of forest initiatives. Last item I'll just mention is that both with respect to the Chesapeake Bay, but specifically for climate progress, I wanted to emphasize to everybody listening in, particularly those who are thoroughly discouraged or disheartened by the lack of real progress at the federal level in the U.S., there are states that are making real, significant progress on climate, not just mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but on adaptation and resiliency and bipartisan public support. The 24-state U.S. Climate Alliance has a natural and working lands challenge, and the 24 states are working to maintain net carbon sinks for the land and to incorporate by 2020 strategies for natural and working lands to be incorporated into each of those 24 states' strategies for climate action. And it just underscores the importance of landscape partnerships to make real progress. So that's a part of what is happening in Maryland.
Thank you, and it sounds like a little beyond Maryland as well.
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you could tell me something about what your experience has been just as a policymaker in the state on how you go about getting this integration among the different objectives in linking climate action with agriculture production action with water action. What are a few of the lessons that you've learned from that?
Well, I am very fortunate to be in Maryland where the citizens and the elected leadership recognize that science and civility and risk-based management are still values in the state. And so a key for Maryland has been to have facilitated dialogues where many different perspectives and sectors are in the room together at the table to find common ground. So we have done that through our Climate Change Commission, and the Farm Bureau and the Department of Agriculture and the forestry industry are in the room. And a lot of the debate sometimes is with urban areas and the impervious surface areas that threaten watershed health. But to have solutions providers from the landscape and agricultural and forestry sectors in the room together to hash out policy differences and agree on scientific facts and precautionary and pollution prevention principles is a big step, and it's a key to making continued progress.
Thank you very much. Let's shift over and look at the international perspective, moving from the United States. Shyla, can you tell us a little bit about what your all's experience has been with sustainable landscapes and climate action globally?
Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully my hair isn't getting in the way of the microphone.
good.
And I also wanted to extend my appreciation to you and to FAO for having me here for this really exciting and important conversation. So I am here representing Conservation International. It's the organization that I work with. And we've been working on developing and implementing sustainable landscapes and seascapes approaches in the 30 countries around the world in which we work. Typically, when we approach a landscape management system, usually we consider 4 different components. One being good governance. How do you ensure that everything is built on a foundation of strong institutions and management and organization of people? How do you ensure that there's sustainable long-term financing so that it's not a matter of us injecting resources in the short term without looking at the long-term revenue and income generation opportunities. The third being biodiversity and natural capital. How do we value the places of critical natural capital in those areas and disincentivize the encroachment or the expansion into those areas? And then last but not least is on sustainable production, recognizing that production is an important source of income and livelihoods for local communities. But ultimately what we're talking about here is how do you grow an economy? How do you ensure that communities are prosperous? How do you ensure that you're not depleting and destroying important critical natural capital at the same time, right? And how do you look at finite amounts of land and area and maximize or optimize all of those outcomes that you're trying to plan for? And so my perspective and my role has really been at the global level. How do you reflect these values in international agreements? And so for a long time, I worked on the Paris Agreement, which we all know was adopted back in 2015. But the focus really was on how do you get universal agreement for something like climate change, and how do you get universal ambition to do something about it? And so what we ended up getting was, some would argue, almost the least common denominator, which is that yes, every country agrees that climate change, we all need to confront climate change, but each country's actions are voluntary and self-determined. So that then begs the question, how do you actually drive action on the ground? Is it through governments? Is it the national scale? And then President Trump threatened to pull out of the Paris Agreement. And that then forced and drove a completely different conversation, which is, what is the role of non-state actors? How can the sum of the parts be greater than the whole? If we mobilize investors, companies, local communities, can we actually incentivize and facilitate more action than what the Paris Agreement at the national level could have done alone? I think what we saw last year at the Global Climate Action Summit was just that. We saw cities, states, governors, mayors, CEOs of companies make unprecedented commitments to climate change, more than trillions of dollars under asset management. We saw civil society organizations like my own having a seat at the table and having a voice, having the opportunity and the ability to spark debate, spark conversation, and empower each and every one of us in creating and solving for those solutions. And maybe one of the examples I can give in terms of the places where the empowerment of non-state actors has been incredibly effective has been in our work in North Sumatra and Aceh in Indonesia, where we've been working in partnership with the government, but also smallholder farmers and palm oil producing companies, who are palm oil being the largest driver of deforestation in the area, but really approaching it by finding solutions for local communities, for smallholders, so that they can increase their productivity. What we saw in North Sumatra is that smallholder production was 35% lower yields than on corporate-owned palm oil producing areas. So we provide them with training, we provide understanding and clarity of land rights and land titling. We work with the government on enforcement mechanisms. We work on trying to find sustainable financing through carbon credits and other types of mechanisms, whether it's through the agricultural sector or outside. And I think that's been a really great example to see how an integrated approach can function and also can link in with a national and international system. So it's been really exciting to see the evolution of both the landscape conversation, but also the international discussion converging with what we've been experiencing and learning here at the landscape scale as well.
Just a question for you, Shaila. In terms of the various landscapes that you're working with around the world, what is your sense about the scale of climate change mitigation and adaptation that you're able to get at this point in time? I don't know whether you're measuring it or just what your sense is about, relative to where we need to be globally and where those countries need to be in terms of their own actions.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see in the last few years also how advanced the science is in terms of really quantifying the various contributions of various measures and actions to solving climate change. What we know that within the land sector, just by stopping tropical deforestation and restoration and reforestation in tropical areas, we have 1/3 of the solution to climate change. 1/3 of the whole solution to the global problem of climate change comes from stopping deforestation and increasing restoration of degraded areas. And that's really a powerful number, and it's one that shocked me even when the science came out. But I think the difficulty then is disaggregating that information to the national level, but also to the landscape level. How do you take a place from being a net source of emissions to a net sink? And that essentially means you have to fully stop deforestation, and you have to start restoring, regenerating, reforesting certain areas, because currently the only technology we have to remove carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at scale, it's trees, it's vegetation, it's regenerating and restoring our natural ecosystems. And I think what can be difficult is the accounting for that. And that's what's made it really challenging for crediting mechanisms like carbon markets to really catch up with what the science tells us. But there are new technologies. There's remote sensing. There's companies that are sending around drone-sized satellites that can provide real-time monitoring and carbon accounting. So I think that there's also opportunities for us to use technology and big data to help increase the credibility in accounting, so that we have more confidence in financing and quantifying the returns on that work.
Thanks very much. Let me turn then over to you, to Ivy, who has been working with jurisdictions around the world on concerted action on climate and the other SDGs.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, on behalf of Energy for SD, I'd like to start thanking the invitation for to be here today. Well, the Network of Regional Governments for Sustainable Development, Energy for SD,
Be slow
is
for
a
the people
network,
on.
is a network of subnational governments that shares common interests in climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development. It was established in 2002 and has over 50 members from 26 countries and 4 continents. Energy for SD is the only international network on sustainable development matters that works with regional governments. And when we talk about regional governments or subnational governments, we are talking about this specific level of government that is intermediary between the center or the national government and the local government. And depending on the country, they have different names. They can be states, as here in the US. They can be regions, they can be provinces, they can be lenders, intendances. There are several names for it. But these jurisdictions encompass urban and rural areas and enables them to apply an integrated territorial approach and facilitate land use planning in a sustainable way. This also allows them to simultaneously address multiple topics and especially their interlinkages, to follow what Sarah was saying, to get out of the silos or where the departments and the teams are. Over the 15 years of experience, Energy for SD has actions that are threefold. The first would be in advocacy, so through accreditation to UN bodies, and we participate in key events and follow negotiations, and to bring the voice and the position of these regional governments to this international agenda. And the second, in capacity building, especially knowledge exchange and knowledge generation. And third, on cooperation. And cooperation, especially among our members, in specific projects that help the regional governments to implement, to review, and to establish targets and actions that could implement these global agendas. Well, it's precisely about one of these projects that I want to talk with to you today. It's called the Regions Adapt, which is a framework to support regions in their adaptation efforts and actions in three fronts. And these three fronts that I just mentioned: the advocacy, the capacity building, and the cooperation. And we have 71 members in this Regions Adapt initiative worldwide. And they are when they join this Regions Adapt project, they are committed to 3 points. They are committed to adopt a strategic approach to adaptation and to prioritize adaptation strategies. Second, they are committed to take action, concrete action on adaptation and key priority areas, and they are also committed to report data. And this is also very important for us because with this information we are able to do an annual report, and then we can assess where the regions are. For instance, in our last report from 2018, we had the data that 22 out of 38 regions have climate actions in land use sector, and 24 out of 38 in agricultural sector. So it's not only on emissions, as Sarah was saying. Climate change is not only on gas emissions, but it's also through biodiversity, water, and so on. So with this in mind, I want to highlight just one example in Latin America region that relates to sustainable landscapes. And I chose one that affects 45 million people. That is the state of São Paulo in Brazil. It represents 22% of the Brazilian population. So the program is called the Water Springs, that is called Programa Nascentes in Portuguese. São Paulo, it is the largest initiative to maintain and restore riparian forests. So, riparian forests, yes. Brazil is one of the 20 countries most exposed to climate change risks, and the state of São Paulo has climatic vulnerabilities associated with precipitation and seasonal events that led to serious crisis in water crisis in the region between 2013 and 2015. And to address these challenges, the São Paulo state developed this Water Springs program in 2014 to expand the protection and the conservation of water resources and the biodiversity. So it's not only about addressing the water environments, but also setting up facilitated water flow regularization, in addition to providing shelter and food for local fauna. And this project is being implemented with public and private investments, so it's very important for us, and this is one feature of all other projects, the partnership that we need to build to realize any project, and also it's also increasing the coverage of native vegetation in springs. And it also engages different partners, not only the public and private investments, as I said, but also with NGOs, with different departments inside the state government, and also with local governments. So, so far, what the last month data that I have from last month, the program planted over 23 million seedlings and restored an area of 14,000 hectares, what is equivalent to almost 20,000 soccer fields. So you can see the size of this program. Well, I think that the case of São Paulo is an interesting experience that is from this Regions Adapt portfolio, and it also inspires other regional governments to take concrete action, to collaborate, and to report on climate adaptation. And just to conclude, I think that I want to stress the key role of subnational governments, regional governments, on climate action. We need to have in mind that cities are not isolated, cities or even rural areas, they are not isolated systems. They should be considered as part of a complex territories, and it's very necessary to address these urban-rural linkages between them, and also the interconnected effects. I think that the role of regional governments is particularly important to enable this integrated territorial approach, and also reducing the increasing disparities that we have between our regions and our urban areas.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you a question in terms of The different jurisdictions, obviously, you have a nice natural experiment of what kinds of institutions they're putting together. Are there any new ways of working within these state or regional governments to address climate change that you think have emerged? Or are they using pretty much the same institutional mechanisms that they have for governance in general?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, I think that regional governments, they also have this innovative way that sometimes in these international agendas, they're always looking and they're driven by national governments. But they're not paying attention that much on what regional or even local governments are doing. And in the end, the actions that are taken on the ground are the one that really matters. And I'm saying on this spectrum of the government, but it's also local communities and also other NGOs that are working on that. So I do think that we need to take into account each specificity of each region or each local. We cannot say that there is one size fits all solution, but for sure they have a lot to contribute to this debate.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask another question or two, but if you all have any questions for one another, let me know about that before we turn it over to the audience. I'm very interested in the point that was made by a couple of you related to financing. And I'm wondering if you could just say, any of you who would like to, say something about what kinds of innovative financing mechanisms are being used to promote climate action in land use. Just one example, maybe that you could suggest to us if anyone has any thoughts on that. Ben, do you?
I can give two, but I'll start with just one.
Start with
okay. So in the early 2000s, the state of Maryland, the governor and the General Assembly agreed to impose a fee on residential sewage. The flush fee is what it was called. That generates almost $100 million a year. And a large portion of that goes to urban and suburban water pollution prevention. But 15 million of it goes towards septic systems, and most importantly, for purposes of this landscape challenge, cover crop, to help subsidize cover crops and continue to ensure that Maryland is a leader in the use of cover crops as a way to slow it down, spread it out, soak it in terms of the rains, and ensure soil health.
You want to briefly mention the second one?
The second one is a really big idea that was launched 10 years ago, and that is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where states, 9 states, soon to be 10, maybe in a year from now 11, totally bipartisan basis, agree to impose a cap and trade system for power plants. And that has generated over $3 billion in proceeds. For the state of Maryland, it's almost $650 million, and that money is then invested in ways that Maryland chooses to invest it, energy efficiency, renewables. But there is a future of investing in landscape, soil health, coastal resiliency, but it's generating a well-supported, publicly supported source of revenue that is not dependent on the federal government, but is a regional collaborative.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any others of you have a Charlotte, you want to
Sure.
suggest briefly?
Great. Yeah, we have a project called Cloud Forest Blue Energy. So we know hydropower is important for many regions around the world. Part of the issue that many hydropower companies are experiencing is sedimentation, which is caused by deforestation upstream in forests. And so there's kind of an interesting financial mechanism here where restoration and reforestation and protection activities of upstream cloud forests is then financed by downstream hydropower companies. And there's kind of a guarantee, and once there's a verification of reduced sediment load, then the hydropower company will repay that initial upfront investment. So it's a pretty interesting innovative finance mechanism.
Thank you. Did you want to suggest something?
The state of Iowa has a program for farmers that they subsidize.
Iowa or Ohio?
This is Iowa. Okay. But Ohio is looking really close at Iowa's thing. We're going to only world make it better. And we've also been looking at a lot of things that they're on Chesapeake Bay. They've really been phenomenal. We need more public-private partnerships.
Tell us about Iowa.
But Iowa, there is actually a payment. You can get a $5 an acre payment that it actually goes to the RMA, the risk management agency, that for as you pay your crop insurance, that you could actually get a $5 discount. But it's in the way.
If you do cover crops.
But it's for cover crops, because they really feel like cover crops need to be planted on every farm, and I believe that way too.
Excuse me, that's the state government insurance system?
That's actually, it's a state government payment, but it actually goes to risk management agency, and it's carried through with a discount on your federal crop insurance. But I really do think that the Maryland has done a tremendous job of getting farmers, and that's how farmers respond. It's an economic incentive that you're blown in the wind unless you.
I think we all respond that way.
We do. But especially in times like this, when commodity prices are very, very low, and we got all these, we got late planting and all that. It's all about economics, and that's why it's really important to get farmers incentivized to do some of these things.
That they're being paid for the ecosystem services that they provide and the climate mitigation and adaptation that they provide.
You bet.
Great. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I just remember from one case from Wales in the UK.
Wales.
Yeah, Wales in the UK. Well, they had this, they established a law to integrate sustainable development and especially to tackle the decline of biodiversity, but they also separate a funding concept line for that. So I think that we need, when we're talking about funding, we need to have the appropriate line for that. And then in this particular project, what was successful, it started as a pilot project first, but then they consulted the local communities. And in this innovative way on how to, this non-traditional way to provide grants, I think that caused an ownership in the population that was beneficiary of it. So it's very important, I think, that to improve this financial for local climate action, but also take some caution with tokenism, in the sense that we keep saying that, well, it's important to address climate change, but we never provide the means of implementation. So I think that
So these were grants from at the state level or at the
state
level directly to local communities
communities,
to do integrated programming around climate action and biodiversity. Great, that's fantastic. Well, I have many more questions, but I would actually like to give the chance to the floor and to those of you who are listening on YouTube to ask your questions. Try to make them brief and clear. Start by telling us your name and your organization, and then we'll probably cluster with a couple of questions at a time, and then I'll bring them back to the panel. Who would like to start? Yes, and just stand up if you would.
Oh, hey. Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Rachel Carrillo, writer. My question's first. The Secretary grumbles. I'm wondering, I did get here a little late, so if this has been covered, my apologies. But if there are any complementary programs between the community, the water ag communities of, say, the Eastern Shore or parts of the Chesapeake, like the traditional watermen and the crabbing industry and the oysters, watermen and women, by the way, working on climate resiliency and carbon drawdown alongside the land partners. And so, I think of farms like in St. Leonard, Maryland and Southern Maryland that have this wonderful opportunity, and they're already working, in close connection with on a variety of other projects, at least economically and in tourism, but on carbon specifically.
I'll take a couple, okay?
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, right next to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Olaf Westerman. I am with the Catholic Relief Services in Baltimore. And my question is on scale. So we have done watershed management for many years, payment for environmental services. And also, it seems like many of the examples that you mentioned are in densely populated areas, maybe besides the farming, but I'm just wondering, how do we take these approaches that we have been doing for many years now, how do you take those to scales, and particularly in rural areas where you can benefit the most vulnerable farmers, and you can also maybe have the biggest impact in terms of adaptation and mitigation?
Okay, thank you. We have another one over here, then I'll take it back to the, let's see, yes, right here. Carlos.
Somebody was raising their hand.
Okay, I'll get them the next time. We got some good time here.
Me?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And then I'll come back to you, okay? I didn't see the hand.
My name is Carlos Klink, University of Brasilia, Brazil. Fellow Brazilian here. I really appreciate what you just said about the farmers and how farmers in Ohio is doing that much difference. How to go to scale, as the colleague just asked, to go to all farmers in the United States or the world? Do you need a different type of incentives, or do you need to be talking better to traders, companies? How you do really break that addiction? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there for a moment, and let me go back to the panelists and ask them to succinctly respond to whichever ones they would like to. Ben, why don't you start with the one that was specifically for you?
Okay. Resiliency. A couple points on working, connecting the dots and the drops and the watts.
The dots, the drops, and the watts.
Water and climate, and with local, with landowners and resource managers. One thing that I'm really proud of is the fact that the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the Hogan administration are focused on coastal resiliency, managing the land. There's a program called Resiliency through Restoration, where we're specifically finding ways to strengthen and fortify, not through concrete, but through plants and nature-based systems. The sinks, that particularly along the coasts, we know that coastal
carbon sinks.
Carbon
Yeah,
sinks.
mhm.
We know that coastal wetlands are particularly good at mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that when you're talking about local land use decisions, this is not something that's going to be successful if it's done by a state regulator like myself in Annapolis or Baltimore. It needs to be driven by local citizens and by local government with state and federal funding. And then just the last thing, it also gets to innovative financing. The success of our state and the other 5 states in the District of Columbia in restoring and protecting the Chesapeake Bay is going to depend on public-private partnerships, as Fred was saying. And so we're really focused on mechanisms where there can be a market for the ecosystem services, whether it's land management or aquaculture. And for us, aquaculture is one of those areas, if it's done right, where the aquaculture industry gets some credit for what they do, the oysters they grow for water quality as well as climate action, that will stimulate more of using living resources to help clean the environment. So that's an area, it's a very important one, and we have more to learn, but it's going to be through partnerships with the public and private sector working together and using science on the value of ecosystems, services, and resiliency through restoration.
Thank you. Let me ask the others of you all to each maybe take a different dimension of the other 2 questions were about scaling from the local, sort of smaller local watersheds to the entire watershed, from going to working with some farmers to working with all farmers. And I wondered if you could each just take one dimension of that and speak to how you think we can move, not in 50 years, but how do we make this happen within an accelerated time period? Anybody want to start?
Sure, I can
Sure,
I can
Shiloh,
start.
go ahead.
So
Yeah.
3 points. 1, awareness. If people don't know, they can't do. Second point is on picking back up on financing. What we know is that the amount of finance for the destruction of nature is 40 times higher than the amount of finance for the protection of nature. So if the decks are stacked against us, even if we double, triple, quadruple, 10 times the amount of finance for sustainable development and sustainable landscapes and seascapes, it's going to be a losing battle. So I think it goes back to lending policies, credit rating agencies, subsidies. I think all of those need to be evaluated, and I think those are all key levers for change. And then also policies, right? Getting the right rules and the right political regulations in place, I think, can also help trigger change at scale.
Great, thanks. Fred, do you want to add something?
Well, I'd like to combine a couple of the questions. How do you bring it to scale? And also, how do you get a farmer to convince to change what he's doing? And it's very simple. No, it's not very simple. It's simply thinking. It's not simple. Believe me, it's not simple. But one of the things that we have to get away from is if you ask a farmer, why do you do certain things? And that's because it's the way we've always done it. That's not a good enough reason. So what we have to do and I truly believe that cover crops should be a part of every single farm out there. And the way you do that is you got to have farmer leaders. A farmer that is a pillar in his community. Farmers trust farmers. And we can say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And most farmers will say, yeah, right. But I mean, you really have to show the economic value. And if the economic value is not there, then that's where we need the public-private partnerships to make it valuable. Because on a large scale, you're going to have to. It's all about financial incentives, and you will get massive movement. And I commend the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed. I mean, everybody grows cover crops because there's an incentive to do that, and we have to do that clear across the Midwest, clear across the world, and in Brazil, and we got to get farmers interested in no-till, and making sure that we have reasons why and get rewarded for these ecosystem services. Now, some things you can do short term, other things are going to take maybe 20 years or 30 years or whatever. But the main thing is we have to get people, especially farmers, convinced that he's going to be rewarded for doing this in this long term. I look at my soil health as my 401k because it may not give me an instant return on my investment, but 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road, my children, they're going to enjoy the benefits of what I've done now.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to add anything, Heidi?
Yeah, I think that besides from what my colleagues said, I would just add the cooperation. That's why we are organized in a network, and that's why we can see different and innovative ideas going on, and where we can learn, and then we can also, again, apply for funding and look for other solutions.
Okay, thank you. There was someone I didn't see over here. Who was that? Go
Good
ahead,
afternoon.
yes. What's your name and where are you from?
My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. I have a question for the gentleman from Maryland. I was on the Metro reading the newspaper recently, and there was a story about the Maryland blue crab population and how it was like really, really diminished like a while ago. And y'all took like some stringent measures to like really cut down on like overfishing and stuff like that in the waterways here around Maryland. And it showed like the numbers of blue crabs, like the population like increased exponentially to millions and millions, almost to a surplus of availability of crabs. That's so much food. And my question for you is, how did y'all get that amount of increase in that population in such a short amount of time? And how are you able to like measure, like these are the adults, these are the child crabs, and this is how many we have, and this is how long it takes to mature? Like, how did y'all get that in such a short amount of time? Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have a couple of other questions I can take? Then we'll respond to them all. I see, yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Robert Jordan. I have a question for Mr. Yoder. I'm very interested in how you have changed your farm practices. You've mentioned no-till, cover crops. You're a rotational farmer. Have you modified your rotation? And have you been looking at the soil organic content or the soil carbon over the years? And I assume you have, and I assume you've seen a dramatic increase. I'd like to hear about that.
Do we have one more question before we go back to the panel? Is there one right over there? Is that a hand? Yes,
Excuse me. Hi, my name is Yola Heltberg. I'm with a startup company in Washington, D.C. that invented the method of growing crops in rocks without the use of soil or fertilizers ever. It's a permanent growing medium, and it touches on pretty much everything that we're discussing here today. I am wondering, how do I get in front of any one of you to actually consider the rocks? I've notified a lot of big organizations, international organizations, the UN, in Rome, in Washington, have been notified of this science, and we will be publishing later this year. But until then, how can I get in front of any one of you to actually get some time to discuss about implementing this,
Okay.
solve world hunger?
okay. Thank you. Want to do one more, and then we'll do another round in just a minute, okay? I don't know if we've had any other questions from the YouTube folks either. Maybe they could line up for the next time. Yes.
In sustainable agriculture.
Your name?
Oh, my name's Alice Ortizar, and I'm from Montgomery County, Maryland. And I've been engaged in sustainable agriculture and efforts to transform our yards into carbon sinks. And actually the research in Maryland, and it's applicable, I think, to other parts of the country, more pollution is coming off of our urban and suburban yard practices than from the ecological farmers. And yet the farmers, at least in Maryland, are still receiving more blame than they are responsible for in terms of polluting our water sources, including the bay. So this is a challenge for Ben. He's sort of in the middle of two politically connected communities. The landscape industry in Maryland at every level is so influential that when I first transformed my turf yard to wonderful watershed-friendly vegetation that had all kinds of amazing critters, including swallowtail tiger butterfly larva, which is prehistoric looking, that the agency responsible for applying the yard code actually substituted their personal turfgrass preferences for what is a wonderful bay-friendly yard code. This has happened in PG County, it's happened in Annapolis, and it's a real challenge to permit residents to do exactly what we must do. When you have an ecological farm or an ecological yard, you've got a carbon sink.
Thank you.
And I just want to add the APA, American Planning Association, put out a report in 2013 entitled Green Infrastructure Corridors, that the yards could be connected not only for wildlife but for carbon sinks, and that's not happening right now.
Thank you very much. A bunch of great questions, and I'm going to ask I'm just going to pick a few of you guys to respond to some of them, and then we can go out for another round. Ben, can you briefly respond to the answer about the crabs, and also the extent to which you're using the yards and suburban and urban stuff as part of the solution?
I can, briefly. And thank you for the question about the crabs, the blue crab. We are not resting on our laurels and celebrating with mission accomplished because weather is a big part of it, and ocean and bay chemistry is a big part of it. But one of the reasons for the great progress and success is the focus on water quality upstream and throughout the watershed. Water quality, disease prevention, and we're very fortunate that the Chesapeake Bay has world-class science monitoring, a barometer for key metrics But a big reason for the success has been a focus on habitat, the watershed health upstream and reducing pollution, particularly from larger sources, point sources regulated under the Clean Water Act. In terms of the point about urban and suburban landscape decisions, residential decisions, it underscores one of the lessons I've learned over the years, which is that culture eats strategy for lunch, and that when there's a culture of wanting manicured lawns, or as someone once said, drug-dependent carpets. Not me, I didn't say that. There's a need for collaborative work, and so we definitely will reach out to Montgomery County. There's a Baywise program that the University of Maryland Extension Service has for certifying for counties, volunteer certification programs for Baywise landscapes or residential landscapes. It's very important, and it's an important part of our urban and suburban stormwater permitting programs. We really try to emphasize reduction of impervious surface areas and green infrastructure, but we have to work with the counties and local governments because that's a really intimately local opportunity for progress.
I had that issue with when I converted my yard to a native plant garden. My homeowners association was not very happy.
Yeah.
Let me turn to Fred, actually, to answer both of the other two questions, if you wouldn't mind briefly. The first one being around the carbon, your measurement of carbon change and what actual level of carbon change you've seen in your soils or those around you for that one. I think if you can stay for the reception, I'd say get in front of all of these folks for it. But I think there's a bigger question that's related to the North American Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance. How are people collecting innovative ideas and getting them out? If you could respond to that a bit.
Well, there is a noticeable difference. I know, like I said, I've been continuous no-till for 15 years, and I would say on average, I've on my soils, but that's the other thing too about landscape soils, they're all different, and so some, we happen to have the best resource for soils in the world. That's Dr. Rutan Lau from Ohio State, and he talks about sequestering carbon, and there's differences, and that's why you have to design a program for your landscape. But in our soils, we've gained anywhere from 1 to 2 points of organic matter. The neat thing about that, for every 1% of organic matter, you can hold an extra 25,000 gallons of water. What that does in the dry time is you got the extra reserve, and you can go on, and then when it's extra wet, like we are right now, we can absorb an extra 25,000 gallons of water before it runs off and creates ditches and the other thing too. But the other thing that adds to the thing is all of the stover or the residue on top, which just slows it down, and it's like a big carpet. So it's very, very noticeable. But the biggest thing I've done to try to be successful is tell other farmers that our Yoder Ag Service, a lot of that's one-on-one, but farmers have the credibility and it's amazing how one success story will breed another success story, and that's what's really to get everyone in there and into the frame of mind to change is just. I'm telling you, if farmers hear other farmers doing it, they're going to do it. So that's why I keep telling the story that farmers have to be at the table.
So how do people who aren't farmers but come up with sort of innovative solutions that farmers might be interested in? Is there a mechanism through the North American Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance to get that word out or to get? Well,
if anybody that has those ideas, yes, contact NACSA and we'll be glad to hear those types of things. But the other thing too that NACSA does is we try to integrate it in through all kinds of associations and people that are actually members of NACSA to get access to their expertise. We have a lot of the folks that are on the ARS labs, our soil test.
ARS?
ARS, yes.
What is ARS?
Agricultural Research Lab.
Thank you. Just for those who don't know all of our acronyms.
And ERS is the Economic Research Lab. Okay. Get those, and then we also are very. We're working with with people here in the capital too. But there's lots of ways to do it. But it takes expertise. But again, the knowledge needs to be learned, and then it needs to go out to the farmers.
Okay,
from
thanks.
farmers.
Great. Thank you. There's a couple of others. I think we've got some from YouTube, and then there was someone here with their hand up right in front. So go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, I'm just going to relay a question came in from the online audience. This is related a little bit to the consumer side. So in terms of from that group wanting to know what can be done, and actually there's a couple questions. So one of them is specific to palm oil and deforestation in the Amazonian Ecuador, and about the certifications. So that might be one part of this solution. But what can be done to help consumers use their purchasing power better to support climate smart agriculture and agriculture that's sort of climate positive? So that's one key question for me.
Great. And can you go ahead?
Hi, my name is Paige Cowie. I work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Foreign Agricultural Service. I work specifically on resilient agriculture programs. Our office has a global focus. My portfolio specifically is in East Africa. And my question is for Mr. Yoder. I'm actually from Northeast Ohio. Go Bucks. And in a lot of our programs, we try and connect with lead farmers. So in terms of when you were mentioning, getting farmers in the know about things that work and things that don't work, I'm interested in what that looks like for you at a local domestic level. In your town in Ohio, how do you share this information with people? I understand that you have leading roles on a lot of national associations, but at a local neighborhood level, how do you share that information? Is it just word of mouth? Do you have local farmers associations? Are there newsletters? In a lot of our projects, this manifests itself in the form of demonstration plots. I don't know if something like that, happens at the local level, if you work with extension agents in the region. So just speaking a little bit to that. Thank you.
Thanks. One more question from the group? Anyone? Okay. Let's go ahead and see if maybe, Shyla, you can respond to the question about how consumers can support this, and maybe some others have a response to that as well.
Great, just a quick response. In terms of palm oil, the certification is RSPO, which is the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. There's also a number of advocacy campaigns to ban palm oil, which doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It's not necessarily about not producing palm oil, it's about producing it in a sustainable way. Because palm oil is actually quite an efficient oil, and it's high yielding, and many local smallholder farmers rely on palm oil for their livelihoods and for their jobs and for their income. So a lot of those campaigns that are calling to ban palm oil may actually do more harm than good, because it might divert that land into unsustainable alternatives for palm oil. So it's a matter of using your purchasing power to direct it towards sustainable palm oil.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that question about working with consumers? What about those of you who are working in jurisdictions? Are there any campaigns oriented toward consumers to support climate smart land use, land management activities? Any examples?
There's in Maryland, I think one of the first states to do this, Governor Hogan signed a law a couple of years ago, pollinator-friendly solar siting program. Pollinator-friendly solar siting programs. It's to recognize that solar arrays, particularly in a state that's the fifth most densely populated in the country, every acre of agriculture counts, and in some areas there's a real need for compatibility of solar arrays with agricultural production and also pollinator habitat. So the legislation has created a program for incentives, certification, and some funding for solar farms that incorporate practices into the solar array, the design and shape of the array that emphasize you don't have to make a false choice between pollinator habitat and clean energy.
So is that aimed at producers? Is there a link also with the consumers of solar energy?
You know, we try to, and particularly the Department of Agriculture tries to market that program. So far,
that sustainable consumption is also on the overarching of the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is something that a lot of our governments are working on this echoing this discourse that we were saying about having an integrative approach. So we definitely need to talk to see to sustainable consumption altogether with biodiversity.
You're referring to the Sustainable Development Goal on sustainable production and consumption.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying? Okay, good. Let me just ask you then, Fred, if you can respond to the question about what are the specific. You talked about one
that are really important. One of the things that we did with our Hard Smart Ag program that we just completed, phase 1, was we had listening sessions. We went around in various places and we invited anybody that wanted to talk about that to talk about it. And some counties were absolutely astoundingly strong, and especially the ones that had a lot of the Soil and Water Conservation District members, that they were smart as a whip and really understood. And they wanted to be the ones, they were passionate about spreading the gospel. There's also a lot of county extension offices that are extremely strong. Some of them are not, but you have to find out those places, and you really, the only way you're going to find out is to go to a farmer and ask, who are the people you trust? Who are the people that really matter? When they say something, that you listen. I've been involved. I didn't mean to, but I've done a lot of speaking at different county meetings and things like that, just to kind of stoke the fire. And you got to get farmers excited about making change. And once they find out that these changes are going to actually improve things, and they can actually make money at it, then they'll do it. But if they feel like it's going to cost them, or they're going to be losing, giving something up, then they're probably going to be reluctant. So there's a lot of good farmer leaders out there that need to be tapped, and train the trainer type of thing. You need to get those people to do it.
Thank you very much. We're actually coming to the close of our formal session here. I would like to have each one of our panelists respond to the question, what is the big message, some of the key messages that you have to the policy community in terms of trying to dramatically accelerate local level territorial landscape action for climate change adaptation and mitigation? If you could just give us one or two things that you think are really important that we should walk away here with. Who would like to start? Charlie, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to start. So two ideas, or two thoughts here. The first being, keep an eye on September. There's going to be a very big summit hosted by the Secretary General of the United Nations himself. If you recall, the last time this occurred was in 2014, when Ban Ki-moon had this same summit in anticipation of the Paris negotiations. So 2020 is being termed the super year. There's a number of different political agreements converging. The Biodiversity Convention targets are expiring. The Paris Agreement enters into force. But we know that the level of ambition from countries isn't where it needs to be. So 2019, this year, this September is the moment to put pressure on governments, on our leaders, to actually step up their game. And it's really the time to then transfer all of that attention into action. The second thing I would say is that now that we have this another political moment, I think the tendency for our politicians and for leaders is to think about more commitments and more targets. So everything was oriented around 2020 in the past, and now everyone's thinking 2030. But 2030 is too late. We don't have the luxury of 10 more years to make a commitment that would then materialize then. So that would be my message, is that I think that it's not a matter of IPCC saying it's 10 years and the world is going to explode. We actually have to start acting now. Globally, emissions need to start peaking in 2020. So let's stop thinking about commitments and getting PR and attention, and let's divert our attention into action.
Thank you. Fred, would you?
Well, one of my biggest things, the biggest thing we need enabling policy. We need a policy that will enable a farmer to stick his toe in the water and try something that they haven't tried before. And I'm a big believer. I think we need something like with a safe harbor part in it where so on a small amount of acres, that's one of the things that we do at Yoder Ag.
Tell them what safe harbor is. They may not know.
Basically, it's if you try something outside of the norm, that it doesn't prohibit you from getting a payment or something like that. A good example is the last couple of years, there's been a question of if you plant cover crops and you have federal crop insurance, there's very, very distinct times where you have to kill your cover crop, and Mother Nature doesn't always work with that. And there's other data that's showing that it might be wise to, in some crops, to go ahead and plant it green, but the risk management agency would not allow that.
Okay.
And so we have to have a way that you give that power to the local landscape guy, where they can make a judgment based on that landscape or that watershed, rather than a one-size-fits-all national deal.
Okay.
But the other thing, just work on different ways that to incentivize farmers to change.
Okay, thank you very much. Ivy?
Well, my key message, of course, will be on the key role of regional governments in taking integrated approaches, both in urban and rural areas. And I think that Energy First is trying to identify the buttons we have to push and how others are doing it. And these tools and the success can, of course, be shared and scale up. I think that we will not have any disruptive change in this kind of meetings, but for sure, this kind of meeting serves to get us inspired, to raise our ambitions, and also call for action, and call for urgency on that action. So let's build these connections, and I think that we can make it.
Thank you. And Ben, last word for you.
I'd never get the last word, truly. I would just say that this year is going to be a very important year, not only on the continued growth and expansion of the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the states, the Northeast, and potential revenue for land-based and agricultural resiliency projects. But also, a dozen or so states are working to try to put a cap-and-trade system in place for the transportation sector from the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic New England states. And if that works, that can possibly create a source of funding for agricultural resiliency and land-based stewardship projects. So it's the idea of a regulatory driver and a cultural acceptance that action is needed that can help generate some additional funding for stewardship throughout the land. Okay. And that's going to be very important.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to have you join me with a big round of applause for our 4 wonderful panelists. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thank those of you who are on YouTube for joining us. It's an important conversation to have. And those of you who are here, I'd like to invite you to join us for a reception, have a chance to talk together one-on-one with the panelists and with the tremendous amount of expertise that's actually in the room, in the audience. Unfortunately, we can't invite you from YouTube to join us for that, but thank you all very much. Bye. It's in the back, behind you is where the reception is. Okay, thank you.